Hollow Knight is an absolute masterpiece, and as one of my favorite games, it was just a matter of time before I ended up making something from it. I thought about sculpting one of the characters, but as the absolute king of art, I wanted to make something bigger, something more challenging, so I decided to make an entire diorama based on one of my favorite areas, Greenpath. Now this is my plan. I'm not going to make a specific part of Greenpath, but I'm gonna try to get the whole vibe from this area in this diorama. Here I'm gonna put the knight looking at Hornet as a little reference for this moment. Here we have Un, here we have the hunter, and here and here and here a bunch of scribbles that I haven't decided what they are supposed to be yet, but I hope to solve that later in the process. For now I'm gonna start by making the lower level of the diorama by turning this little block of clay into an appropriately sized base. Then, for the back of the diorama, I'll wrap this aluminum foil mountain with some clay. Let's put it in place, and now I'll start to add all the other pieces that will form the main shape of the diorama. Throughout Greenpath you'll find a bunch of noisy acid pools, so I'm gonna put an acid pool here and a bigger acid pool here. For the edging of these pools, I'll place some blobs of clay until the shape of these pools is formed, and with that the first stage of the diorama is finished, which means it's time to add the details, starting with this building from the Lake of Un, which I'm gonna put here. The first thing I'm going to do is to shape this little ball of clay until it looks like a severe thumb. Then I'm gonna carve these lines throughout the whole thing, and on some of these lines I'm gonna place some clay noodles. Now let's make that tiny door with that tiny frame and those tiny steps, and because this building is supposed to be old, I'll give it some cracks. And with that I'll start to add the grass, which I'm gonna make by cutting this piece of almost dry clay, just like that. And no, this is not a piece of baked or cured clay. It feels like it's cured, but that's because it's pretty damn old. But as my gerontophile friend used to say, just because it's old doesn't mean it's useless. I mean, I'm gonna use a bunch of this clay for this particular build, so it's actually pretty useful. And speaking of things that are useful, these giant spiral boulders are pretty useful in the sense that they cover a lot of space and are pretty easy to make. See, that was easy. The bigger ones are generally in the background, so I'm gonna put the bigger ones on the background, and the smaller ones are generally not on the background, so I'm gonna put the smaller ones on the not background. Next up on this tour of random things on Greenpath's background, we're moving on to one of my personal favorites, these pillar things from Hornet's boss room. In this case a cylinder with a round tip will do for the main shape. Then I'll carve those spirals, and lastly I'll give it some cracks. Now something I noticed while touring on Greenpath is that it is filled with round rocks. Some are pretty small, some are big, and some are pretty big. The point is that this thing is in desperate need of round rocks. I also noticed that on some parts the floor is covered with round rocks too, but these ones are flat and a bit smaller than the other ones. If we look at the plan again, we can see that I originally planned to have a waterfall coming from here, but after carefully analyzing the diorama I realized that a waterfall coming from here, landing here and then continuing here would look better. And yeah, that means that this platform now needs a little pool, and I also have to rearrange some of these rocks as well as cutting off a bit from these edges to clear the way for the waterfalls. Now in order to bring this whole thing together, I'm gonna cover the entire surface with the not baked but still kinda hard clay that I used for the grass on this building. I'm also gonna take this cutter and carefully poke the clay to accentuate the texture even more. And with that, the main sculpting of the diorama is done, which means it's finally time to make some of the residents. This is the hunter, and it'll start out as a little mountain of clay on this side of the diorama. Then I'm gonna carve a little cave here for the face, and I'll cover the entire thing with more grass. Then I'll poke some holes for the teeth and for those spikes on top of him. For our next Greenpath resident, the massive moss charger. I'm gonna make a fat little slug, then I'll use the kinda hard but still not baked clay to make the grass texture, but this time I'm not gonna cover the entire thing. Instead I'm going to texture it in rows, blending the side of the clay that's pointing in that direction with the rest of the body. This thing also has a bunch of mossy dreadlocks, but I'll make them later with air dry clay. For now I'm just gonna leave him here while I work on our next character, Un. We'll start by turning this little ball of clay into a fat long turd. Now I don't know how long Un is supposed to be. In these fan arts she is depicted as a pretty long lady, and I think she looks cool like that. For her underbelly I'll mark out where I want the edges to be, then I'll come back with a needle to place each one of those lines. Now once the belly is done I can get to work on the details on top, which consist of mainly a bunch of spots. For these, some balls of clay of different sizes slapped on here and there will be enough. And at this point I'm also going to give her the final pose. For her eyes I'll bend a couple of small wires until they look like a pregnant S that's looking up. Then I'll stuck them where her eyes are supposed to be before wrapping them with clay. A tiny ball placed here, another one here, and a little line here will make the finishing details on this charismatic slug. And that means that it is time to put her on the diorama. Now, the only time that we can see her on the game, she's on a lake of acid, and because I really didn't plan how this thing was going to look on the back, I didn't place any pool or lake here, and I'm too lazy to make something like that here, so I'm just gonna put her there and let's just pretend that she's sunbathing or something. Another character that's going to be sunbathing in this diorama is Cornifer. He'll start out as a little ball on top of a bigger ball with an outline for his belly. Then a flat noodle with some holes and additional details will make that strap. This little thing will make his trunk, and these little balls will make his glasses. For the maps on his back I'll make 4 tiny sheets of clay, which then will be rolled up until they look like this. Then it all gets held together with a flat noodle and a not flat noodle on top before placing this whole thing on top of this ball. And before putting him on the diorama, I'll make a couple of tiny worms for his feet. Then I can get to work on his arms, which I'm also gonna make by using a couple of clay worms, but unlike the ones for the legs, these ones are longer and have some additional details. A couple of noodles will make his antennae, and lastly I'll give him his map, his feather, and the other sheets that he always has around. At this point I noticed that the bottom of these pools looked plain boring, awful, and trash and shit. Now I'm not exactly sure how the bottom of these pools is supposed to look like. Based on this I would assume that grass is the only thing you can find there. So adding the kinda hard but still not baked clay on the bottom of these pools is the next step. Once I'm done with that, I'll add these 3 spikes that for some reason I forgot to put before. At this point we could say that the polymer clay part of the process is done, which means that now we can move on to the air dry clay part of the process. I'll start by making an extremely thin sheet of green clay, then I'll wait an entire day until it hardens, and once it's ready I'll cut out a bunch of tiny pointy strips that will make some of the taller grass as well as some of these dangling plants. I'm also going to wrap a couple of needles in gray clay, leaving some of the needle exposed in order to make some of these suspiciously shaped things. Now if we look at the plan again, you'll notice that Hornet and the Knight are standing in a couple of platforms. Well, it's time to make those. So I'll start by making a not so thin but still kinda thin sheet of grey clay, then I'll wait an entire day until it hardens, and once it's ready I'll cut out a couple of rectangles. Some lines applied with the needle will provide the texture, and some shorter rectangles cut out from a thicker sheet of clay will make the supports for this platform. I'm also gonna add some clay between these pillars to form the shape of an arc, and a bunch of tiny balls will make the final texture. I also made the platform that's on front of this building. This one is a bit different, but it was easier to make anyways. For our main guy, we'll just need a piece of clay with the shape of a Lego man head, a couple of curved worms, a little purple mountain for the body, a couple of little wires for the legs, a little flat triangle for the nail, and that's pretty much it. Yeah, he's pretty easy to make. Hornet is a bit more complex, so I'll go more in depth with her process. First I'm going to turn this little ball of clay into Hornet, and that's it. Now I'll stuck them in place with a little bit of super glue, then a quick wash followed by a quick dry brush will make these platforms look a bit less shit. And before putting them on the diorama, I'm going to give this entire thing some color. I'll start by applying a dark green base coat over the entire thing, followed by a yellowish green dry brush over top. I even though Greenpath is primarily green, every now and then you'll be able to spot some bluish purple or purplish blue grass, so I'm just going to poke this thing here and there with a brush barely dipped in blue paint. Then I'll paint the rocks and the building with a greenish grey tone, and with the pillars I'll use a greenier greenish grey tone. And with that we can finally paint On, the Hunter and Cornifer while trying my hardest not to paint the already painted grass. And if you're wondering about the mouse charger, I made his dreadlocks with air dry clay as I said previously before painting and gluing him onto the base. I also made a couple of extra characters off camera as I felt that there were a couple of empty spaces that could benefit from having someone on them. Greenpath also has a bunch of rooms filled with thorny vines, so I made some thorns and some vines. Now all that is left to do then is to glue the platforms and to prepare the resin for the acid pools. These acid pools are pretty green but still translucent, so I'm gonna tint the resin green with raw acrylic paint. I don't have a proper dye for this and I don't have the money to buy one, so I'll use what I have. And fortunately for me, it turned out pretty great. I'll start with the waterfalls by delicately applying some resin on this plastic circle until I have two kinda messy strips. Then I'll wait a day for the resin to cure, and once it's done I'll remove them from the plastic, cut off a bit of the excess and put them in place, bending them at the top, trying to form a little wall so that when I eventually pour the resin it doesn't leak from this side. And speaking of pouring the resin, I'm gonna put some Mod Podge here to properly blend the pool and the waterfall, here to make the waterfall look a bit less plain and shit, and here where the waterfall hits the pool, as naturally there will be some waves coming from this point. I also added a few white highlights here with basic white paint. And that's pretty much it. Okay, please leave a like and a comment and subscribe to my channel if you liked this video. I'm pretty happy with this one, it looks cool. I noticed that the scaling on some parts might not be correct, but I don't care and you shouldn't either. Maybe I'll do more areas. I love crystal peaks, so yeah, I think that one will be fun to make. But yeah, that's it. Okay, bye.